feeling safe at work is, when you first kind of think of the concept, you're thinking, okay, am I physically safe? Is a crane going to fall on my head while I'm working? Am I wearing proper PPE, gloves? Am I using safe equipment? That's the surface level, we're safe. If you work from home like me, you are safe if your walls do not fall on your head. But as you dive into this, you realize that safety goes far, far beyond just the physical aspects of life. And so it gets pretty complicated. Do you feel safe enough at work to have a conversation with your bosses if something difficult happens? Do you feel safe enough to be surrounded by your coworkers? Do you feel comfortable in your space? This is something that is worth exploring and also worth implementing as a strategy. And that's really the topic of conversation today with the founder of Canadian Equality Consulting, and that's Marcie Hawranik. Nice to meet you. Nice to have you here. I appreciate your insight and your time.
Thank you.
Marcie, you're the expert here. What is psychological safety? I'm sure those two words, we can kind of pick up on what they are, but really, how would you define it?
Yes, so psychological safety really expands the traditional notion that we have when we think of workplace safety. Like you said, it goes beyond physical safety and built environment that you work in. Psychological safety was a term coined by Dr. Amy Edmondson from Harvard Business School. This was around the late 90s. Psychological safety as a concept has existed longer than that, but she was the first one that labeled it and gave it a term or a title formally. And it came from her research that showed that the highest performing teams weren't the ones that made the fewest mistakes. And instead, they tended to be the ones willing to admit and discuss mistakes, have challenging conversations with each other, have fruitful discussions and questions, and share ideas openly. So it was psychological safety as a culture within a team, essentially, where the culture is safe enough to take risks, to ask questions, to offer challenging opinions without fear of rejection or punishment or a punitive type of culture in an organization. So as an example, if you're in a project meeting, if you're a junior strategist or a junior employee, and you see an error or a flaw in, let's say, the strategy you're working on, in a psychologically unsafe environment, you'd stay silent, or because you'd be overly worried about being punished or overstepping or potentially oversharing. But in a psychologically safe environment, you would feel comfortable to raise that concern. Your team would listen to it, ask questions, dig into it, and then ultimately result in a better plan and avoid a potentially costly mistake.
So, it kind of is self-explanatory in the sense of it's obvious as to why this is something we would want in a business. But do you find that this concept is a tool that can be used for growth and maybe more strength within a team? Like, it starts off simple, but as we feel that comfort, we can continue using those strategies to kind of lift each other up, sort of thing.
So psychological safety really will fuel business growth. So it should be seen as a necessary component for a competitive edge or a competitive advantage. And what we're seeing, for instance, in today's volatile economy, right? There's a recession, there's tariffs, there's housing shortages, employee pay isn't keeping up with inflation rates. The problems that we're experiencing as a society and even in workplaces are too complex for leaders to have all the answers on their own, right? So we need teams who can speak up, who can challenge assumptions, who can experiment without fear of failure. And that's really what fuels and drives innovation.
Is this a nice to have? Is this just something that's good to think about or maybe be a little bit of a checkbox? Or why is it maybe more, and I'm sure I know your answer, a much more strategic, actual, valuable asset to have on a team?
It definitely is a strategic necessity for teams. Without psychological safety, people can hide problems, right? They avoid risks. They may only share ideas that conform to the dominant view or perceptions. It can lead to confirmation bias. But if you really want resilience and agility and creativity in your team or in your organization, psychological safety needs to be at the core of your leadership strategy. So we don't want employees that hold back great ideas, right? or mistakes that go unreported and can't be addressed, or we can't learn from them, right? That just results in lower engagement, turnover rises, teams become overly risk adverse and less innovative, and ultimately it results in financial and strategic consequences for the organization.
So let's say, a team has maybe identified where there are some weaknesses and they want to actually implement some strategies to fix this. How do you think a business leader can actually, what's the word I'm looking for? Look at this on paper, to actually make sure that they're implementing the strategies, or maybe measure what they're actually doing as a successful, metric?
So there's lots of ways for leaders to measure and to build trust and grow psychological safety in their teams or in their organization. You hinted at it, is that measurement is super important. So the first step is to kind of assess where you're starting from. And you can do that with engagement surveys. You can ask questions like, if I make a mistake on my team, is it held against me? Is it safe to take risks on this team? Or I feel comfortable sharing a dissenting opinion without fear of reprisal or punishment. So you can phrase it a number of different ways, but that's a great kind of litmus test to see where you're at. You can also do focus groups, chat with folks. There's anonymous feedback tools. Some folks start by observing meeting dynamics, seeing who speaks up, whose ideas are acknowledged, who is dismissed, or who stays silent. That can be a starting point. I will note that simply observing meeting dynamics isn't totally objective, because people have varying communication and personality styles. So we wouldn't want to confuse introversion with a psychologically unsafe environment. But that's just a little side note. But ways that a leader can kind of own this beyond, doing an assessment, seeing where it's at, or asking those questions, is the number one way a leader can build trust and grow psychological safety in the organization or in their team is to model the behaviors that they want to see. So that involves admitting your own mistakes, thanking people for raising concerns, actively seeking out diverse perspectives. And this is can feel contrary to what traditional notions or perceptions of leadership characteristics have looked like in the past, right? We used to feel that, strong leaders can't admit weaknesses, right? You need to be, very directive in your approach. And then we've seen how those companies have struggled over time and haven't been as innovative or haven't grown like they could have, right? So we know now that there's a greater need to combat groupthink, to combat confirmation bias, to expand your thinking. We see the benefits of diverse teams. So this challenges that traditional belief in a certain way. But over time, if you model that behavior while also setting clear expectations for others to also participate in that behavior. So if you set expectations or create incentives around, I want you to respectfully challenge me, right? By saying that and then responding to folks that do very constructively and not defensively, that will over time be sort of signals to the team that will create those new behaviors you're looking for. So sometimes in a coaching session, a leader will ask me, well, how do I actually do this? Telling my team I want constructive feedback isn't enough for them to do it. So what we often say is talk about your own limitations, right? Or criticize yourself out loud to show that you can handle the truth, right? Read out some of your worst feedback, right? Show humility and just share, look, these are things I'm actively trying to get better at, and I'd love your help on how or where I can improve.
In the blog, you talked about the 4 sort of dimensions of psychological safety. Or have you already started to kind of dive into what those are with what you've just kind of spoken through here? Or are these sort of more cornerstones of where you can expand on this to really tell if your workspace or your employees are feeling like they have psychological safety?
Exactly. So we often talk about the 4 interconnected sort of dimensions of psychological safety, and they each build upon one another. And when you're looking at assessing where you're at in terms of psychological safety, you can use these to also help frame your questions, to help guide, measure where you're at with each of these 4. But the first one is around speaking up without fear of reprisal. So that's like the basic foundation of psychological safety. So are you safe, are people on your team safe to voice concerns or questions or ideas without feeling ridiculed or punished? So it's the very base level. Then it grows into 2. The second dimension is around inclusion. So this is where equity and inclusion comes into play. Are you able to kind of be yourself? And that doesn't mean bring your whole self to work, because not everyone wants to do that or chooses to do that. It's more so around employees feel that they can share their perspectives, their differing perspectives or lived experiences without having to conform to whatever the dominant group believes. And then third, the next level up is sort of learning and experimentation. So where you are safe, you feel safe to take risks, make mistakes, try new things. And then lastly, innovation. This is where innovation really thrives. Innovation safety, where it's the highest level, where employees can confidently challenge norms, propose bold ideas, engage in fruitful, constructive debate, and feel valued for doing so.
And it's funny, right? Because you as an employer, you want your employees to be able to have those aha moments, those challenges, and be able to make those mistakes and to grow from them. That's the best way to learn anything in life, is to screw it up first. And so I'm curious, though, I'm not sure if you wanted to expand it upon the idea, because obviously a huge portion of what you do, it's in your name, is equality. And so I'm curious where, or maybe if you could expand on how psychological safety actually kind of intertwines and intersects with equity and inclusion.
Great question. So psychological safety is it's a key component of inclusion, of an inclusive culture. So for instance, at CEC, we do workplace culture assessments, and one of the 5 dimensions that we gather data on and analyze in our culture framework is psychological safety and trust, because it's such a core component of inclusion work. And having psychological safety really ensures that every voice, especially those often overlooked or marginalized, can speak up, be heard, and shape decisions, right? Because we know disproportionately people from underrepresented backgrounds or may not fit the dominant group or identity group that exists in an organization tend to, if they have different perspectives or lived experiences or ideas they share, they tend to be more reprimanded. So psychological safety really is embedded in inclusion work and needs to be a necessary component of it. So when you look at who is rewarded for speaking up versus who not, that's how you can kind of also tackle improving it and growing in your organizations. What I also a nice way to think about how they're interconnected is psychological safety really actualizes and turns diversity in your organization, if you have a diverse team, from that representation into equity and an inclusive culture, where folks can truly participate and be valued.
Right. It takes it from being surface level, makes it intentional. And so it's funny because it's not like this is a checkbox, right? You're not just going to achieve psychological safety and then have it forever. It's not like some certificate. It's a feeling when you come into work. And so I'm curious, what are some mistakes that organizations tend to make when they maybe reach this moment, but then it starts to erode, or they start to make some mistakes that can kind of set them back a bit?
So some common missteps that leaders can make include reacting defensively to feedback, ignoring or dismissing ideas, punishing mistakes instead of treating them as learning opportunities. Leaders can also unintentionally erode safety if they are consistently favoring certain voices, like the loudest person in the room. If they fail to follow through on commitments they've made, that erodes trust and can lead to teams feeling like it's risky to speak up because nothing will be done if they do, right? And then there's a ton of body language, like small signals, eye rolling, interrupting, inconsistent messaging can all stifle innovation and prevent folks from sharing. One example that I like to give is that, for instance, an employee, if they share an idea in a team meeting, and as a leader, even if you know that idea is impossible to implement, okay? Either you don't have the budget, you don't have the resources, or it's just not a priority for the organization. Instead of shutting it down, right? You might have an instinct to be defensive and, shut it down right away and move on. But instead, to create that culture of trust and psychological safety, what you should do is pause, thank the employee for sharing, for giving their views and their feedback, ask them questions, have a little discussion, or even one-on-one. Invite them to talk it through one-on-one and use that as a growth and learning moment. And that will really continue to encourage challenging conversations. And one thing I will say is psychological safety is primarily a leadership responsibility, right? So everyone in the organization plays a role in it for sure. But since leaders set the tone, they model vulnerability, they establish the norms often for how people communicate, and to take risks, that's why it is primarily a leadership responsibility. And employees do play a role by engaging respectfully and speaking up when they can and supporting peers as well.
So if a leader is kind of listening to this conversation and realizes, whoops, I don't do any of this, where do they start? Because it could be intimidating, right? An idea of, oh, I messed up. Now I got to really fix this. And we've got 4 dimensions here. We've got so many different moving parts to this puzzle. So how do you start? And is there a one-size-fit-all best place to start?
There are steps you can take to start if you don't have a culture of psychological safety right now. It takes time for any culture shift in an organization, but it's never too late if you have a growth mindset and the desire and capacity to change. And I believe everyone has the desire and capacity to grow and learn and continue to change, right? As we evolve as humans. So one of the first things you can do, if you haven't done it yet, is start with, as a leader, own your past mistakes. So just admit it, own your past mistakes, listen openly, create safe communication channels for employees to speak up. So if it may not be, one-on-one with you or in a team meeting right away, but it may be through an anonymous feedback tool, or it may be through an employee survey, and then you can use that to start the conversation with folks. And trust grows through action, not words. So taking time to encourage challenging conversations, being very mindful of how you respond to them in the moment so you're not defensive or you don't shut them down over time, following up on them, being consistent in communication over time, all of that will help you build trust. What I'm seeing right now is a lot of companies are struggling and are in like a layoff mode right now. Right? So a common question is, how can I rebuild trust, let's say, after a series of layoffs? Right? So when you as a leader can't share the details surrounding the layoffs or the terminations to help, clear up misconceptions or assumptions folks are making. But psychological safety is less about full transparency and more about how you are communicating. So acknowledging the uncertainty, being honest about what they do know, and showing empathy for their concern. So even if it's just a sounding board, being a safe place for employees or teams to express their feelings and ask some questions and suggest solutions, and keeping them feel connected to the organization.
You said in the blog that psychological safety isn't about avoiding discomfort. Nobody likes to feel uncomfortable, but sometimes, it's worth it. It's kind of like, getting a massage. It feels like hell in the moment, but like 3 days later, you're going to feel really glad that you went and got that knot sorted out. So what would you say constructive discomfort looks or maybe feels like in practice?
So constructive discomfort, and I love this term, is when teams engage in really honest and sometimes challenging conversations that push ideas forward rather than shutting them down in its simplest definition. So it looks like respectfully questioning assumptions, debating different approaches, giving candid feedback without fear of retaliation. So I may be a little biased. I love constructive discomfort. My background is in conflict resolution. So I always encourage folks, don't shy away from conflict or challenging discussions. This is what will deepen trust and build bridges and create deeper relationships with one another and ultimately help improve your organization. But if someone shares an idea and instead of being shut down, if the conversation shifts to exploring the idea, the concern, it can ultimately lead to a much stronger plan, right? So when discomfort is productive, it really sparks learning and creativity and better decision making. Too often, people that speak up in organizations are quickly dismissed. They receive really kind of reactionary responses, defensiveness, and they're labeled as complainers, right? But if you have someone sharing feedback constructively that is sharing ideas, right? So they're giving as well, and this is consistent, that's what you really want, right? Those people are culture carriers. And as long as they have, the best interest of the company at heart and are consistently still willing to give, those are actually the best people to listen to and to bring in closer and coach you.
Well, the blog, Rethinking Psychological Safety. Marcie Hawranik, it's been a pleasure getting your insights into this. And there's always so many fascinating topics with the team at CEC. You guys are so keep up the good work. Thank you for your time today. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. Thanks, Ryan. It was great.